Eric, I saw recently, I don't know which podcast this was, but you were talking about the high volume that you've been doing and how you've been seeing progress. It might have been you guys actually talking together. And you said something along the lines that was very disappointing to me, which is that you said your calves are just where they are. And you've basically given up hope that they're going to change. So one, what's that about? Two, I don't know if
Mm.
you're aware of some new research on this, but it seems like if you completely stop training your calves, that might allocate more muscle to your upper body. So that's how I'm interpreting it, at least.
Yeah. So two things. One, the calves did make progress from the high volume training I did and the stretching protocol I did. And right now we're just going, cool. Let's just hold on to that and put our efforts. It's not like I'm not training them hard still. It's just there's only so many hours in a day, and I have to do a lot of volume to progress. So right now, I would say they are on maintenance while I'm emphasizing most other body parts, but not
Gotcha.
all. So
Okay.
that's one thing to put forth. Yeah, the second one is a pretty cool study that recently came out, covered it in Mass, and we talked about it on Mass office hours. I would say that this is very important to understand that it's preliminary data. So it was a secondary analysis of a study on training frequency. Um, and what they did is pretty cool, is they used an AI-assisted full body MRI to look at not only the muscle groups that were trained, but also the muscle groups that were not trained in the lower body in a group of individuals who were doing leg extensions and leg curls. The reason why that's relevant is that most of the time, I would say like 90% of like hypertrophy studies that are out there is us using ultrasound at specific sites, and we've pre-selected the sites because we're training those muscle groups and we want to see whether their response to training. And if you read the limitations section of a good paper, they'll say, hey, like if we measured at 60% of the distance of the femur, we're not sure if the growth was homogeneous. Also, we didn't measure the vastus medialis, the lateralis, that could have been different, yada yada yada. Um, MRI is great because you can get a lot of data, but MRI is also incredibly tedious to actually analyze. So the use of full body MRI with an AI assisted, much more time efficient way of looking at the muscle volume enables like new insights that we haven't had. One of them is this study where we can essentially look at I say we, like I am science, but I
Mhm.
didn't do this. We don't have MRI. I did. This is another research group entirely. This research group was able to look at muscles that they considered secondary in the leg extension, leg curl, primary, and then not trained. And a really interesting thing occurred where there was actually significant atrophy in the soleus, which importantly doesn't cross the knee. So it's probably you wouldn't expect it to be involved as a even a stabilizer for knee extension or knee flexion. And the adductor magnus, which you also wouldn't expect to be involved. And those are also arguably the two biggest muscles that were probably untrained. They actually significantly atrophied in this study. That's relevant because this is a study on untrained individuals. So you would not anticipate necessarily that anything would change except for growth in the muscles that were trained because they were kind of at quote unquote baseline. Um, and then that in and of itself, a little bit interesting. The the piece that makes it even more interesting is there were significant correlations that were inverse between protein intake and energy intake. So the higher someone's energy intake, the less likely and less atrophy or no atrophy at all that occur. Meaning that in the people who consumed the lowest energy and the lowest protein, they were more likely to see that decrease in their soleus and their adductor magnus, and just in generally like the amount of atrophy compared to the amount of hypertrophy. And there's a cool graph where it shows all the different muscle groups, which ones grew, which ones didn't, and then which ones were actually significantly decreasing. And there's another graph that shows individual participants and how some people had no atrophy anywhere, and other people had almost an offset completely of the hypertrophy with atrophy elsewhere in muscles that weren't trained. So this is what I would describe as preliminary evidence of like a different kind of body recomposition of,
Right.
like amino acid reallocation when not enough supplied through the diet. The quote unquote untrained muscle, the biggest ones with the largest quote unquote reservoir, are more likely just where it's easier to measure changes because a smaller change in a larger muscle group is going to be a larger net amount. So you can actually detect it. There could be some reallocation going on. Big caveat though, first study, secondary analysis is something else. So it wasn't necessarily powered to detect this research question. And then the third big caveat is that it wasn't like they did a month of let's just chuck these people in the MRI while they're untrained just to see the normal amount of variation in these muscles. We don't know the kind of the normal plasticity or variation in what appears to be transient atrophy hypertrophy, which may or may not actually be true tissue change, could be hydration or whatever in untrained individuals just over time. So I think it is really interesting, but we probably shouldn't be making sweeping conclusions about specialization cycles, training at a deficit, et cetera, et cetera, quite yet.
I remember someone theorizing years ago that, and there was not really any evidence for this. They just kind of thought, well, you don't ever see it, which is to say that they thought nobody could maximize their upper body size if they didn't train their lower body at all. They just thought, the body just, it would be too out of alignment basically to do that. And I don't know if there's really any evidence for that. If anything, this would be evidence against that. Again, I understand very preliminary. Would you conjecture anything about that, one way or the other?
This is where it's always see this is my personal bias. Basically, what I'm going to say is this is why it's better to be me than someone else, which is, what everyone thinks. But this is where the siloing of being in like the hypertrophy community or the bodybuilding community or the powerlifting community or the weightlifting community kind of can make you make silly conclusions or like not paying attention to history. Sometimes people get up their own ass or they're only focused on the immediate. Most bench press only records are higher than the bench press three lift records. And Paralympic powerlifters, they're doing all right, And
Yeah.
not only in some cases are they not training their legs, they're in a wheelchair.
Right.
So obviously strength and hypertrophy are not the same thing. They're pretty closely linked in my opinion. But yeah, I don't think so. Like that doesn't
Yeah. I don't either, but
it,
it was just, yeah.
it doesn't check out to me. And I think another way to look at it is from a like an evolutionary biology lens. This is something that if you talk to anthropologists, they view everything as all of our adaptations are here today because they needed to be for the species to survive, or they were sufficient at least for us to pass on our genes. And sometimes exercise scientists forget that and they get caught up in mechanisms and kind of just like don't even think about that. Like one example, when we had the hormone hypothesis still in favor, where we think, oh yeah, like circulating levels of growth hormone and testosterone are really doing an important thing for muscle growth. There was the hypothesis that, hey, like if you do legs first and then arms,
Right.
bro, your arms are probably going to grow because of that big growth hormone spike. That was subsequently disproven. But if you think about that from like an evolutionary biology realm, like if you run 400 meters, your growth hormone is really high, and then all of a sudden, like you're fuck, I'm growing, and then like the hunter gatherers are all dying because their body's like, well, I've this growth hormone's around, so I've got to make every muscle like that is moved after this
Right.
sprint grow, even though you're not eating anything. So
Right.
what we actually see from an evolutionary biology lens is that everything to get humans to where they are today is based upon cost saving, right? So if we compare us to our closest living ape ancestors, or like if we compare us to the other great apes, we have like 60% more lower body muscle mass and less upper body muscle mass. We have far less type 2 fibers. We have far more type 1 fibers. We have a higher baseline body fat. Like chimpanzee males are running around at like 3.5% body fat all the time. And they have these really explosively powerful, strong muscles. And they like climb through trees. And that's because they forage in a very tight area. They get food in a much smaller space versus us running around the entire African savanna when we first evolved. Also, apes have much more complex digestive tracts. That's why they're able to extract protein and because they eat a massive amount of plants and then are able to get nutrients out of it. We don't. To grow our big ass brains, we shrunk our gastrointestinal tract, which then required us to go be out in a much larger place, forage more types of foods, have to get a greater variety of our diet, which also required us to think more. So it's kind of this chicken or egg thing. But the point being, before I go off on an anthropology lesson that's completely unnecessary and waste all of our time, and Steve's like, I got to go to bed, all of our adaptations generally make sense from a survival of the species standpoint. And when you're off on a kind of a tangent, like, oh, maybe growth hormone's going to make my delts grow for no reason. It's like, would that really be something that would help us survive? Not that you should just therefore logic your way through things. We still need to empirically test it, but some of those things really don't hold up when you think about it from that perspective.